who's from the English department of Lucknow University, and she is going to talk on education, literature, and politics. Reflection on women's interventions in Lucknow, 1925 to 1965. So, welcome, Fatima.
Thank you. So, as Professor Charu pointed out, the title of my paper is Education, Literature and Politics, Reflections on Women's Interventions in Lucknow. And the time period I'm covering is 1925 to 1965. So before I begin my paper, I must acknowledge my gratitude to the organizers, Professor Margaret Pernow of the Max Weber Forum, Professor Nishad Zaidi, Ms. Sayyida Hamid, and the Max Weber Forum for inviting me to this workshop. I owe this paper to the wholehearted support of Mr. Wajahat Habibullah and Ms. Tehmina Punwani, who shared very graciously very significant readings that helped me draft this valuable information on Razia Sajjad Zahir. Truly, this paper would not have been possible without them. So my paper revisits distinctive efforts by 3 women in Lucknow who contributed meaningfully in shaping women's lives. It reflects upon their political agency. Am I going too fast? My paper is a little long. I'm talking about 3. All right, I'll go slow. That's perfectly all right, but it's the time constraint that's making me do this. So I revisit the distinctive efforts of 3 women in Lucknow who contributed meaningfully to shape women's lives. It reflects upon their political agency, their active engagements with education, and the production of literature, all of which aimed at improving the condition of Muslim women, because this was an important question during this time. The 3 women foregrounded in my study in chronological order of birth here are Begum Inam Fatma Habibullah, Begum Qudsiya Azaz Rasool, and Razia Sajjad Zahir. The 40 years covered in the period are very fecund as regards the woman question and contingent social and political developments. This period also witnessed severe ethnic polarizations in the country. These years are also crucial because they cover a phase during which undivided British India was decidedly on a modernizing trend, alongside struggling for independence. And following that, independent post-colonial India was forging new directions in practically all fields of human existence. So before I actually launch into talking about these women, I would like to give a very brief historicization of the time period within which these women were working, so as to give a context as to why they were doing and how they were doing what they were doing, and the challenges perhaps that they were facing. So post-1857 colonial policies found the Muslim community facing various challenges in regard to education, employment, their socio-cultural practices, ethnicity, and beliefs. Many intellectuals understood the detrimental effects this would have on generations to come and responded accordingly. The Aligarh movement, as we have seen earlier, made groundbreaking efforts to at least curb, if not reverse, this trend. But Sayyid Ahmad Khan repudiated the idea of education, formal education for women. The community could not modernize if it continued to observe archaic parda and marriage practices in domestic and public spheres and exclude 1/2 of its population from education. So by the 20th century, the Muslim community seemed orthodox and insular to the point of being regressive. In 1914, the Begum of Bhopal, now this is a very brief contextualization of a year-wise, what happened when. In 1914, the Begum of Bhopal founded the All India Muslim Ladies Conference, comprising Ashraf Muslim women, to address issues related to parda, early marriage, education, and protection of their legal rights. During the Khilafat movement, B. Amma garnered wide-scale support from the community when she spoke in defense of her imprisoned sons. She emerged as an icon of protest, balancing Islamic ideals with a courage that drew a number of women into the vortex of the struggle. Alongside, Gandhi's non-cooperation movement provided more opportunities for women to come out of their homes and participate in a variety of reformative practices. These developments during the 1920s in public and social spheres indicated clearly that women's education was a must if they wanted to participate in any kind of nation-building activity. Now, parda began to be looked down as an oppressive practice, hindering education and social well-being, and evil running contrary to Islamic injunctions. I can answer questions on this later. Gradually, Ashraf Muslim women consciously came out of Parda, and a generation of educated women who were also in positions to implement change began to emerge. My source of reference over here is Karen Deutsch, and it's her study on Muslim women during this particular period. And it is Humaira Chaudhry who has talked about the political period during this time. The All India Women's Conference that was founded in 1927 provided better opportunity for women's education, contributed towards their uplift, and tackled issues related to their civic, legal, and political rights. Muslim and Hindu women jointly debated issues and passed resolutions till 1932-33. Sometime in the 1930s, women in Lucknow joined the AIWC. When the Simon Commission opened the debate on extending women's enfranchisement in 1928, issues of parda, property rights, and education came up in significant ways. While seats were not reserved for women, women were encouraged from taking part in the legislative. During the years following the partition, the Muslims in India found themselves feeling guilty or were forced to feel guilty about the communal separatism and that partition had reinforced. They contended with multiple marginalizations and often found themselves victimized, muted, silenced, and criticized inside and outside their homes. I am quoting Humaira Chaudhry over here. So I come now to my three women. The first woman I look about who was functioning against this background is Inam Fatma Habibullah. She belonged to Kakori, married Sheikh Muhammad Habibullah, an educated talukdar of Saidanpur in the United Provinces. The family lived in Lucknow. Though she was not formally educated, Inam Fatma was open-minded, progressive, and sagacious. She learned English and came out of Parda sometime in 1924. She was deeply religious and traditional, seeking at the same time to modernize the women of her community. Begum Habibullah engaged actively in public life. She was a committed politician who began her career with the women's wing of the Muslim League in 1936-1937, when she fought and won a difficult election to become one of the first women members of the Legislative Assembly of the United Provinces as an urban candidate. She represented the All India Women's Conference before crucial committees in Lucknow, opposed reservation for Muslims as a minority community, believing that it was demeaning, and stood against the idea of equality. Her keen interest in the welfare of women had the government appoint her as honorary magistrate. She was the first Lady Municipal Commissioner of Lucknow. As a member of the governing body of the All India Women's Education Fund, she helped institute several schools for young girls, including Lady Irwin College here in Delhi. She headed and contributed meaningfully to several reformist organizations and was a member of the Lucknow municipality at the time of independence. Sometime in the 1920s, Begum Inam Habibullah instituted the Talimgah Niswa, a school for young girls. It began as a small enterprise, educating girls from classes 1 to 5 in a sprawling old kothi in Shaukat Ali Ka Hata, Rakabganj. It had two large adjacent fields. Initially, most of the girls belonged to reputable Ashraf families, and though the school did not advocate parda, the girls usually observed it, even commuting in closed palanquins or in carriages covered with curtains, or in their personal vehicles. In 1929, the school shifted to its present location on Jagat Narayan Road, and in 1940 it began to receive aid from the government and was declared a junior high school with Hindi as its medium of instruction. In 1943, it became a high school under the UP board, and in 1950, it became an intermediate college. The educational standard was high and the atmosphere conducive to study. The Urdu imparted was of especially high standard, with stress on a good level of spoken and written idiom and literary studies. History, civics, geography, economics, home science, and art were taught at the school. Tailoring, science, and commerce were later introduced into the curriculum. From the very beginning, the school stressed on outdoor sports, such as volleyball, basketball, and badminton. Participation of the girls was mandatory. As a result, Talimgah produced many athletes and sportswomen who participated in inter-school, district level, and even state level competitions. They rarely lost inter-school competitions. Several teachers too were enthusiastic sportswomen, and when I spoke to one of the students, she was actually recalling all the names of the teachers who participated in the sports with them. So several teachers who too were enthusiastic sportswomen, excelling at volleyball, basketball, and badminton. The school also engaged its pupils in literary and allied activities. It had a tradition of offering dramatics, dance, singing, creative writing, bedbazi, and also a fancy dress show. Girls participated in competitive inter-school co-curricular events. This was most often with Karamat College because that was the other school that was doing very well in Lucknow. And all women's Meena Bazaar open to guardians displayed the girls' handicrafts and needlework annually. Begum Habibullah made it a point to visit the school, inspect it, ensuring that it ran smoothly and that teachers were personally involved with each student, ensuring, in addition to academic development, the moral, educational, vocational development of every girl, so that she evolved into an all-round manner. She evolved in an all-round manner into a confident, upright, well-mannered, and socially well-adjusted girl. The school also provided residence facility to economically deprived women and employed them to prepare tiffin for the girls, thus fostering the spirit of self-worth and self-sufficiency among them. In her presidential address, now this is a manuscript that I found and I'm actually almost translating it over here. In her presidential address at the 53rd annual meeting of the All India Women's Educational Conference in Jabalpur, 1944, Inam Fatma cited jealousies of fellow Indian brethren. There are several incidents that she quotes. I'm not quoting them over here, but I can refer to them later if I'm questioned. Jealousies of fellow Indian brethren, disinterest of the colonizer in promoting education among Muslims, and above both of these, the ignorance of the Muslims in regard to education and learning as prime factors for their educational backwardness. She spoke about the merits of women's education and exhorted women to wake up to the harm they were permitting against themselves. She urged them to stand up, as education would enable the entire community to overcome backwardness and scale new heights about which, being less or uneducated, they were quite unaware. She goes on to argue that having incurred severe repercussions through their refusal of Western education, the next great error the Muslims were committing against themselves was that of denying women educational rights. Reasoning that Islam does not differentiate between men's and women's education, she stresses that women ought to receive more than basic or higher secondary education, because that will help them to run the household. It is only higher education, she insists, that will help them to safeguard their political, sociological, and economic rights. She adds that in itself, Western education is not harmful. However, the manner in which it is dispensed is what makes it damaging. She believes that generally young girls and boys who receive Western education drift away from the hallowed history, literature, and culture of their own faith. And she mentions that they are so taken up by the communist principles, but what they fail to realize is that socialist principles so popular today are actually very similar to Islamic precepts. And she adds that Islam is the only religion that postulates divinely ordained equality and respect to women. The present education system, she adds, offers this same education for girls and boys. We've heard these debates before, but we have a different point of view over here. She argues that the present education system for girls and boys is identical, and that consideration should be given to the fact that girls should be given or taught a different kind of curriculum that will actually enable them to participate in improving the community and the nation itself. In regard to the debate during those days in Muslim families surrounding Dini versus Dunyavi Talim, or religious versus worldly education for young girls, Begum Habibullah, who sought to marry the two, emphasized that it is our foremost responsibility to establish schools where Islamic and worldly education will be imparted to girls simultaneously. She also advises on several logistical issues, conceding that there is a paucity of funds to meet women's educational requirements, particularly for Muslim girls. She exhorts those who have sufficient influence to appeal to the government to contribute towards raising funds for Muslim women's education. She advocates also the establishment of women's educational committees at the Zilla level, so that girls in villages can go to school. And she also advocates the establishment of a separate committee to formulate a separate curriculum for girls' schools, stressing that Muslim women be given appropriate opportunities to play active roles in these committees. Finally, she advocates the appointment of a Muslim inspectress to oversee the proper functioning of women's schools. I come to another part of her advocacy over here. Often during the 20th century, women who traveled abroad wrote travelogues or travel essays providing details of foreign lands, traditions and practices, governmental laws, policies, and undertakings. The purposes could have been many. Often these travel writings were meant as advisories or means of learning for less traveled readership and aimed to improve the social scenario at home by introducing readers to the best practices abroad. Begum Habibullah wrote her Taassurat-e Europe, Impressions of a Journey to Europe, in 1924. This was a travelogue detailing her journey to the continent. She was visiting her 3 young sons who were studying in England. She was full of misgivings about their residence in the foreign land. She feared it would corrupt their, studying abroad would corrupt their faith. It would make them drift away from their culture. It would make them forget their prayers, and so on and so forth. She was also worried about how she would maintain house in the foreign land where domestic staff were scarcely available. And this was often a topic that featured in her conversations with the guests, with her friends and with the guests who visited her. She writes in detail about Dorchester, where she and her husband rented an accommodation. She describes the people, the sights, the sounds, the cultural mores. The travelogue brings vividly to life her fascination for the new worlds she discovered, including the workings of government and the women's movement in Britain. Her descriptions are interspersed with her reflections and observations on several aspects of life in a distant but better developed land. She tries to link the women's modernizing movement in England with the modernizing practices prevalent at home. Throughout the travelogue, she introspects about the benefits her Urdu readers will have from her work, for it is their good that she has in mind. Now, there are several more books that she has written. I'm not talking about all of those, but I thought it worth mentioning that she wrote an Urdu Qaeda, which is still prevalent in the madrasas in Saharanpur today. This brings me to the second woman in my study, and that is 10 minutes. It's very difficult. Can you give me a little more time, please? Thank you. Thank you. Begum Qudsiya Aizaz Rasool was born in Malerkotla in Punjab, and she was the daughter of Sir Zulfikar, who was a member of the Legislative Council and a Council of States. He had brought up his daughters with absolute independence, giving them the liberty to study formally in Western schools, and she enjoyed, a very rich and diverse, I would say, life outside her house. And even when the family entertained at home, usually the European guests, she was always a party of those gatherings. She was always a party to those gatherings. She married Nawab Aizaz Rasool, a zamindar from Sandila in the United Provinces. She was now supported wholeheartedly by her husband in all her political endeavors. In fact, Aizaz Rasool is known to have taken a back seat and let her rule from the front, so to say. In 1936-37, Qudsiya was elected as a member of the United Provinces Legislative Council from Hardoi, Kakuri, and Kheri districts, a position she held in 1951. She has the distinction of being one of the few women legislators to be elected from a non-reserved province in British India. Sometime in 1937, she gave up Parda, stoutly resolving that she would not visit any home where Parda was reserved. She played an active role in reshaping or reshaping new post-colonial independent India. In these crucial times, it was particularly significant that the Muslim woman represent her community at the highest levels in parliament. Not that she could have voiced the concerns of every one of her community or even introduced radical changes that would reverse situations at the ground levels for them, but she could voice some of their concerns and endeavor to address at least some of the issues at hand. Moreover, as by negotiating or influencing resolutions and declarations and representing her country abroad, she stood out as an educated, informed, and outgoing Muslim woman who could make interventions that would help buoy her community. Naturally, this ran contradictory to the stereotype that defined Muslim women during those days. So, Begum Rasool was the only Muslim woman among the 15 women members of the Constituent Assembly to draft the Constitution of India in 1946. She began by representing the United Provinces as a member of the Muslim League. As a member of the Constituent Assembly, she held opinions on matters of national, political, or public interest, debated on India's being a part of the Commonwealth, on property rights, reservations, minority rights, and on forbidding untouchability. She contributed significantly in discussions leading up to the framing of the Constitution. Qudsiya strongly opposed the partition of India. She also opposed the acquisition of property and compensation for it. In 1947, she stoutly refused Jinnah's offer to join the Pakistan Muslim League. In 1950, she dissolved the Muslim League in the United Provinces and joined the Indian National Congress. She also opposed the zamindari system, believing that the lands the farmers tilled should pass over to them because of the toil they had put in. As an elected member of the Fundamental Rights Minority Committee, she opposed reservation, believing that the Constitution guaranteed and protected fundamental rights of every citizen without discriminating on religious ground, and argued that fundamental rights should be such that they should not be liable to reservation and to changes by acts of legislature. I am quoting from her autobiography over here. She contributed to the advancement of girls' education and women's education, insisting on the necessity of girls' primary schools and establishment of women's universities. Moved a resolution that prevented women from entering public services, as the government had laid down rules debarring them from appearing in competitive exams and the Public Services Commission. She advocated establishment of a women's police force, a plea she complains was accepted almost 40 years after she advocated it. She engaged in considerable social welfare, was a member of several social organizations, manager of the Karamat Girls Muslim College for over 20 years, and she also instituted a college for girls and boys in Sandila, which still runs. She looked upon women's participation in sports as an extension of social welfare activities meant to improve their emotional and physical development. From 1954, she served as the president of the Indian Women's Hockey Association for 20 years. During this time, she contributed significantly to popularizing women's hockey as a sport across the country. This, she says, was a very formidable task when she took it over. She took personal interest in encouraging guardians overcome their conservatism and prejudices and send their wards out to play. Owing to her efforts, the Ministry of Education declared hockey as an all-India women's sport. The Begum Ezaz Rasool Trophy for women's hockey was instituted in recognition of her contributions. So this brings me to the third lady in my, we can change the picture on the, thank you. It brings me to the third lady in my study, and that is Razia Sajjad Zahir. And we see that her politics was very, very different. So, popularly known as Razia Appa, she married the Marxist ideologue Sayyid Sajjad Zahir at the age of 20 in an arranged marriage in 1938. They both belonged to elite, landed Muslim families, and his mother, Lady Wazir Hassan, was a non-cooperator, actively involved in the women's movement. Razia Appa had graduated from Ajmer, and after her marriage, she did her post-graduation from Allahabad University. She observed Parda, but gave it up after she got married. With her husband, she came under the influence of the communist ideology and soon transformed into an active member of the Progressive Writers Association. Soon after their marriage, Sajjad Zahir was imprisoned by the then British government of India for his Communist Party activities. From 1942 to 47, the couple lived in Bombay, and this was a particularly difficult time for them, particularly for Razia Sajjad Zahir, who had never gone out to work before. But now she took up occupation. She started teaching in the Shaukat Muslim Girls' School to supplement the family income. And she also stood by Sajjad Zahir when the Communist Party office was stoned or set afire. Together then, the couple arranged and actively engaged in meetings of the PWA. In 1947, the family returned to Lucknow. In 1948, the Communist Party sent Sajjad Zahir to Pakistan to formulate the Communist Party over there. And we are aware that he was imprisoned for the Rawalpindi conspiracy case in Pakistan. So she accompanied him to Pakistan for some time with two of her daughters, and then she came back very soon. Emotionally and monetarily, this was a very trying time, and survival itself was a challenge. It is then that she joined the Karamat Muslim Girls College as a teacher in order to earn a living. Her fortitude made her stand out not merely as the wife of a communist ideologue, but as a woman who stood as a living example of that cause, soldiering on in its pursuit. She strove to a life of self-respect, dignity, depending upon no one but herself to bring up the daughters. All the while, she campaigned continually for her husband's release, writing to the highest authorities in Pakistan. Ajmal writes about her that she stood out as an epitome of courage, optimism, sincerity, keeping alive the glow of communism and socialism. Razia Appa taught Urdu at Karamat Muslim Girls College. Throughout her career as a teacher, she served as an example, striving to inculcate modern values and Marxist principles she valued so greatly among the young girls. She kept them abreast with political and cultural goings on, simultaneously instilling in them a love of the rich and diverse Urdu literary heritage they had inherited. She epitomized the spirit of learning, participated enthusiastically in all the students' activities hosted by the school, and in her bid to develop their confidence, urged the girls to volunteer to participate in activities outside the school as well. Actually ushering them to various, conferences and conventions. She knew each student by name, gauged and responded to each one's disposition in likewise manner, and took a personal interest in each student's well-being. She was a favorite with the girls who looked up to her with both fond affection and undisguised admiration. Closely involved with the administrative responsibilities assigned to her, she often stayed back in the office till late after school had given over, devoting her time to maintaining the records and looking after the upkeep of the school and the hostel it ran. She traveled by school bus every morning to the school and back, greeting the girls with warm enthusiasm and ensuring that each one was dropped back home safely in the second shift of the bus. Razia Appa had been writing stories as a young girl, publishing them in the children's magazine Phool and later in Tehzeeb-e-Niswa and several others. She now became an avid writer, writing in the communist and socialist strain. As a woman member of the Progressive Writers Association, she was invested with what it meant to become modern. She acknowledged the radicalizing influence of the Marxist ideology and the PWA on her politics, and this is unequivocally evident in her literary output. Razia Appa's writings emphasize the sufferings of the ordinary people and exhibit utilitarian and socialist purposes. Several stories projected the complex dilemmas experienced by women within the political and social complexities of her contemporary existence. She explores gender relations, women's oppression, the development of a modernist identity, as well as the more deleterious effects of poverty and ostracism faced by marginalized women. Sensitively narrated, her stories depict diverse psychological perspectives that characterize human nature. Her characters are familiar, recognizable as friends, acquaintances, relatives, neighbors, or passers-by in the streets. As readers, we can share in their joys, sufferings, and empathize with their predicaments that may well be our own. So Razia Appa was a writer, a translator, and an editor of her husband's writings as well. She also read her stories, features, and pen portraits for All India Radio in her bid to educate her listeners, spread the socialist word, and add to the family income. Rafat Sarosh writes that she was much appreciated for her sensitive style and intonation. Back in Lucknow, after Sajjad Zahir's release from prison in Pakistan, the couple lived in a small outhouse on Wazir Hassan Road in the sprawling koti of Justice Wazir Hassan, where the girls grew up. Together, the two of them began the Shab-e Afsana, an evening gathering with fellow comrades and writers discussing politics, reading poetry and stories. These were followed by animated critical discussions on the stories, the language used, and how it would influence and affect the people who read them. I conclude now very quickly. At home, I'm now talking about the legacies that these women left behind and how their works were taken forward. At home, Begum Habibullah was a dedicated and doting mother, instilling good moral values in her children. As a grandmother, she was keenly interested in the lives of her grandchildren, and while they were with her, she instilled in them ethical and humanistic values that would shape their individualities. Her grandchildren recall that in her old age, she listened regularly to the radio in her bid to stay abreast with the world affairs. The school she started, Talimgah Niswa, received minority status in 1976. Today, the school enrolls about 2,000 young girls, functions in 2 shifts, and employs a teaching staff of about 35 women. Most of the young girls studying here come from economically disadvantaged families, the others preferring to opt for mainstream English education. Parda is observed only as a matter of choice, and girls mostly commute on foot or by means of public transport. These young girls owe much to Begum Habibullah's foresight and commitment to the cause of education. In 1984, Begum Qudsiya Aizaz Rasool contested an election on a Congress party ticket from Sandila and won what she calls a secular election with overwhelming majority. She was pitched against a candidate from the BJP who had vitiated the atmosphere communally. Her victory endorsed that the people were not swayed by such communal politics. Her enormous contribution to the country's political affairs was recognized by the Government of India by means of a Padam Bhushan in 2000. She also wrote a detailed and insightful memoir after retiring from active politics. Her granddaughter recalls that she had a phenomenally good memory, gave in charity without expecting returns, and contributed wholeheartedly in support of the needy. In Delhi, when Razia Sajjad Zahir received like-minded guests, she often bemoaned that the spirit and fervor that characterized the 40s and the 50s no longer existed. There were no more gatherings like the Shab-e Afsana, and nobody discussed literature. Her daughter Noor Zahir notes that till her last, writing remained integral to her existence. Her dedication to the subjects of her writings was so steadfast that she overlooked her children's visits in preference to writing about their trials. In fact, there is an incident which Noor Zahir talks about, which actually angered her because the mother kept saying that, no, let me finish what I'm writing. It doesn't matter. You will come again. Let me finish this. So, at Karamat Hussain, she was a living example of values she wanted to instill in the young girls. She was recognized by the Soviet Nehru Land Award in 1966 and the Uttar Pradesh Sahitya Akademi Award in 1972. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that very rich paper.